From your favorite source for Chicago White Sox talk, delivering news, interviews, analysis, and more. This is the Sox Machine Podcast with your hosts, Jim Margulis and Josh Nelson.
Thanks, Rob, and welcome to a new episode of the Sox Machine Podcast. I'm your host, Josh Nelson, alongside the managing editor of SoxMachine.com. It's Jim Margulis as we record a new episode on Thursday night, January 5th, 2023. In the baseball world, we are starting to see more introductions of signees for teams, and we just saw it with the Chicago White Sox as Andrew Benintendi officially is introduced to the Chicago White Sox media and the fan base as he'll be wearing number 23 with the White Sox, following all-time White Sox greats and Jermaine Dye and Robin Ventura and Jake Lamb and Mark Tehan. I kid, of course, at least on those two. But we'll talk about Andrew Benintendi's introduction, and also Pedro Grifol introduced Benintendi to the media and to Chicago, not Rick Hahn, as Rick Hahn had to travel, but Rick Hahn still spoke to the media. We'll talk about Rick Hahn's thoughts about the second base position, and also Grifol's thoughts about the 2022 White Sox and what he would like to fix immediately during spring training. But Jim, first, even more site news. Big shout out to Brandon and Ron, our newest Patreon Veterans Committee members. We know that in the last episode, we explained as far as what's coming in 2023 at Sox Machine, some of our 2-year plan. And right away, Brandon and Ron jumped in to be part of the Veterans Committee, and half the slots have already been taken. And we've seen even more Patreon supporters as well signed up after that podcast episode. Thank you guys so much for doing that.
Yes, I think we're now at 8 of 16 spots in the Veterans Committee, so thank you very much. And no matter what, as we've talked about, and as I say every time we mention the Veterans Committee, like even if you can't do the Veterans Committee level, like any support and all supports helps us towards our goal. So thank you, to all tiers, all levels. Hopefully we'll continue to be worth it. Yeah, that's our goal. And then, our goal is to get you full time. As we mentioned before, in case you missed the last podcast, the heart of the 2-year plan is to get Josh to be full time on Sox Machine to allow us to do more without getting burnt out. So that's the idea. And so thank you to everybody who's jumped on so far to help us towards that end of getting Josh down to one job, and this being his one job. He has one job. That's what we want to be able to say to Josh whenever he falters. You had one job. You used to have 2. Now you have 1.
Yeah, that would be great. And we even got, people have reached out who've had video experiences. That, again, is a big job to tackle and having that type of experience. So we'll be reaching out to some of you who have had this type of experience. And yes, I did hear loud and clear those that support Sox Machine from the great state of North Dakota, Jim. So
all right.
Thank you very much for that, and encouraging for them to reach out to me. Now I know more about North Dakota than I did last week, or I should say earlier this week. So thank you again to Brandon and Ron, and thank you to everyone that has signed up recently for the Sox Machine Patreon at patreon.com/Sox Machine. All right, baseball news. Andrew Benintendi officially introduced to the Chicago White Sox. And right away, when asked about why he's coming to Chicago and why he picked the White Sox, Benintendi mentioned that the organizations wanted him for a very long time. And it does bring up an interesting flashback talking point, because when Benintendi says a very long time, it goes all the way back to his Arkansas days when he was playing with the Razorbacks. And the White Sox were scouting him for the Major League Baseball draft back in 2015. We know the White Sox did not take Benintendi because Benintendi ended up getting drafted by the Boston Red Sox. Then very next pick, the White Sox took Carson Fulmer. So let's go back in time, Jim, based on the information that we know about that particular draft. If Benintendi was available, do you think the White Sox would have drafted Benintendi over Carson Fulmer?
I think so, just because I remember it before Benintendi got good, or towards top 5, number 1 overall prospect type good. And before Carson Fulmer before that became more and more of a bad idea as years went by. Like I remember Benintendi fairly early on being the White Sox could have had him and we're interested, but he didn't get there. And that was before Carson Fulmer, just ran out of ideas, or the White Sox ran out of ideas for Carson Fulmer. So I remember with Benintendi that he was with the Lowell Spinners of the New York Penn League when that was the thing, before the minor league contraction. And he was playing in Troy, where I used to live, playing the Tri-City Valley Cats, and that was 2015. And I went there to see him because I thought, like, I remember the White Sox being interested, and I should go see what he's all about. And like the first at bat, he homers over the right field fence, and thinking like, oh well, there you go. There's Andrew Benintendi. Kind of remember along the same lines like Mark Appel when he made his pro debut at Tri-City in Troy. First pitch gave up a triple, and that kind of foreshadowed the way things are going to go for him. So I'm 2 for 2 on the my first impressions from pro debuts. But yeah, I remember that being there at the time. I just wonder, like, if Benintendi were in the White Sox, would he be a White Sox right now? Or would he have reached free agency? Would he have not signed an extension? And would he be looking at another team right now, taking advantage of the jet stream out to right field and being more than the White Sox are willing to pay? Kind of a fascinating alternate timeline there. And maybe if the offseason crawls to a halt, to which not necessarily a bad thing. It used to be super slow in mid-January, and I used to have to think of post ideas to get through the fallow period before Sox Fest. Now Sox Fest isn't a thing, so we don't have that for content. Might be worth thinking about, just in terms of like what it may have looked like had Benintendi been drafted by the White Sox, and had the White Sox been able to try to see his career all the way through.
I think it would have been a fascinating debate to be a fly on the wall in the White Sox war room back in that draft, because the amateur scouting director at the time, Nick Hostetler, was in love with Carson Fulmer. I mean, he made the comment that Carson Fulmer's the type of guy that you want your daughters to marry. And a bit odd at the time. And Carson Fulmer had this like bulldog mentality that they hyped up, and he was helping Vanderbilt, leading Vanderbilt's charge to the College World Series. I think it would have been a fascinating internal debate if Boston did not take Andrew Benintendi, to see how the scouts of the White Sox front office would have talked that way through, and who would ultimately make the decision and who that decision would be. But obviously that didn't come to fruition. Benintendi got taken one pick ahead. But I don't know if it's so much a slam dunk. Maybe it is at Rick Hahn's point of view, because that was Rick Hahn's guy. But as we have learned over the years covering the Major League Baseball draft, not everyone agrees in that war room on who the first round pick should be for the Chicago White Sox. So I just get a chuckle out of that personally, because Rick Hahn makes it sound like, oh, he was our number one on the draft board. It's like, I don't necessarily think so. That might be a bit of a revisionist history all those years ago. But alas, Andrew Benintendi is finally with the White Sox, and the White Sox have tried to trade for Andrew Benintendi as well, probably back in the Chris Sale trade, but Dave Dabrowski at the time said no to that. And Dave Dabrowski did also say no to a Moncada and Rafael Devers, and Rafael Devers is going to be staying in Boston for a while with his new big contract. But the other thing that caught my attention with Andrew Benintendi, outside of him going to be wearing number 23 with the Chicago White Sox, was this quote that you also referenced in your column on SoxMachine.com, Jim. And it harkens back to a conversation that we had recently about Andrew Benintendi and how we may be seeing a power uptick from Benintendi with the White Sox. And Andrew said, quote, "For me, playing at Kauffman in 2021, I got pretty frustrated just flying out to, we joked about it all the time, these long flyouts. I'm not the biggest guy. It's going to take everything I can to hit a ball out of that stadium. So going into last year, I was thinking, let's just hit for higher average and higher on base, and hopefully this works, or I'm going to be in a world of trouble. I'm trying to be a complete hitter. Playing in guarantee rate field, a lot of those long flyouts will turn into doubles and home runs without even trying to change anything." And I think that's enlightening coming from the player perspective after the conversation, the analysis that you did, Jim, about Benintendi hitting at guarantee rate field. It sounds like Benintendi agrees with you. If you're worried about my 5 home runs last year, don't be, because more power is coming.
Yeah, I'm glad he's the one who said that and not Rick Hahn. Like Rick Hahn during his media session. And can we take a second to remark on how strange it was that Rick Hahn was not there for the franchise record introduction, like the franchise record contract. There's like a two-step process to have it. And you would think like they had 3 weeks to settle on a date to all be in the same place to get there. You would think that they would be able to make that possible and make it more of a thing versus Pedro Grifol introducing them. You think they'd all be there to be on hand for this. It took a little bit out of the proceedings and made me just wonder, like, are they a little bit, does he want to dodge the questions about it being a $75 million being the franchise record contract or something like that? Like, that struck me as a little bit weird. And Benintendi was asked about that, and he said it was humbling, and he misused the word humbling a little bit, but also it is like a reflection of just like, he shouldn't be the guy getting a franchise record contract necessarily. There should be like one superstar ahead of him getting that 9-figure deal. But that aside, I'm glad Rick Hahn in his Zoom call the day before said that Benintendi, like, even, there's a chance that he might be able to hit more homers at guaranteed rate field, and that there might be a way that, the balls that he hits just, by luck of timing, by just being in the right place at the right time, doesn't have to do a thing, and just might get to 15, 20 homers, just hitting the same he was at Kauffman. And they'd be happy with that. But they also like the guy he's been, the production he has offered in the last 2 years at the at Kauffman Stadium with the Royals. And that was reassuring to me more than Rick Hahn saying that we think we can, get him to pull the ball in the air and get to 20 homers, because I don't think you sign a guy for $75 million and hope he can be better. If this is like the White Sox big investment for this entire rebuild period, like, you should get a ready-made player with that money. You should get somebody that you're happy with, that you don't feel like you have to tweak, because who knows, maybe you make a change and that creates another problem, opens up another whole little bit of whack-a-mole when it comes to mechanical issues and whatnot. So I'm happy that he's happy with the player as is. And Benintendi's the one saying, I have the ability to change some things. Like, I was a pull hitter before I realized that at Fenway that there aren't really rewards for that. So I started using the monster, and then I moved to Kauffman Stadium and couldn't really get one out of the alleys either way on a reliable basis. So it wasn't worth trying to go that way. And then with the Yankees, unfortunately, only 33 games, and he had the wrist issue before the power uptick could manifest itself. But there is a post on Fangraphs by make sure I get the name right, Esteban Rivera, whose name is new to me, but he talked about how there is a sense, or at least a little bit of a track record here, of Benintendi being able to change his batted ball profile based on where he's hitting with a little bit of time. So not completely out of the question, not like somebody who's never been able to pull the ball in the air before suddenly trying to do it, because as we've seen many times, and with many prospects and many major leaguers, that pulling the ball in the air against the best pitching in the world is not something that can easily be taught or learned midstream. Like, it's either something you have, or you make yourself a useful player around that weakness. And Benintendi, although he's had limited time to show it because the ballparks he's played in hasn't really rewarded it, has at least shown the ability, when the opportunity presents itself, to start working in that direction.
So during this press conference, I was going to save that bit for later, Jim, about Rick Hahn not being there on Wednesday as he was away. We don't know why he was away, but he did have a Zoom press conference with the White Sox beat reporters the night before at 7:00, which is also weird. But anyways, Pedro Grifol was there to answer questions from the rest of White Sox media that were invited to the introduction press conference. And Grifol was asked straight point, what does this mean for Eloy Jimenez? Is he going to be your full-time DH? And Grifol did the best that he could to talk around the subject, made it clear Andrew Benintendi's here to play left field. Andrew Benintendi's going to play left field. But that doesn't mean that Eloy Jimenez is not going to play outfield in 2022. And I'm recommending him to continue in the offseason to work at being a better defensive outfielder, and also get some angles and take some fly balls in right field during spring training. All right, Jim, what do you think about the idea of maybe Eloy Jimenez getting some games and maybe some starts in right field for the White Sox?
No.
Okay. Glad we agree.
Yeah, it's that's a case where, like, Grifol, that might be him showing his greenhorn status in terms of just like maybe not having seen the things we've seen with our White Sox fan eyes. Like maybe, he's watched it from the other dugout and said like, all right, it hadn't stored it away as trauma, just stored it away as like, oh, that was a good development that ball split the gap, or that it was rounded off, or that we took an extra base on a throw. But when it comes to like Jimenez, like even if you trust that the range could hold up, or like, that his routes would be okay and that he would not like hurt himself trying to operate a different corner and breaking in balls a different way, and like not knowing the number of steps he has going to his left before he hits like the side wall and gets tangled in the netting. There's still the matter of like his arm not being his arm's not even really that good for left. So for right, like I can just imagine more and more bases being taken on him than they already were. And given that it took a while for Jimenez to throw the ball into the infield, that was another problem early on, was his decision-making and the quickness of his decision-making with where to go with the ball. Like from right field, would that be a resetting the counter on just like the angles and what he's learned and who to throw to, that sort of thing? So I don't like it for a whole host of reasons. I can see like him, Grifol saying that, he's not going to be DH only because what if something happens to Benintendi? Then all of a sudden, Jimenez pretty much has to play left, or has to play some left. So you don't want that to go to rust. You don't want Jimenez to say like, or say to Jimenez, like, you're going to be DHing. Feel free to gain 30 pounds. Like, you don't want to say that like that. So that I understand, but I think it's just the case, like the more you talk about it, and like, if you talk about it, then the question is like, where will he play? And then like, there's only one other spot he can play because he's not going to play center. So you have to kind of mention rights, especially since like Oscar Colas hasn't won the job yet. The White Sox haven't signed really a credible fourth outfielder to play out there. So he is like the only option if you don't want Andrew Vaughn out there to be like, well, Jimenez can play some right, and Gavin Sheets is theoretically there and improved over the course of the year, but there really isn't a satisfying answer to right field. So if you felt like you had to say something, that's really the only thing you can say. Hopefully it'll be a case where like the White Sox will acquire somebody, and then it'll be, Grifol will say he's still going to rotate in and out of some spots just to keep him fresh because we want him to have that skill, but he won't have to walk into that dead end of being like, well, there's only one other outfield spot he can play if Benintendi's in the left, and just, and try to pass it off with a straight face. I would hope that it's not something he's really satisfied with saying aloud, but it's just something he has to say because there's only one corner to speak of.
Yeah, with the Oscar Colas not being mentioned, reminder, Colas is still not on the 40-man roster.
Yes. Yeah, correct.
So the White Sox are, even though we know that Colas is probably the front runner to start in right field for the Chicago White Sox, until he's added to the 40-man roster, don't be surprised if Rick Hahn or Pedro Grifol, they don't make a lot of mention about Oscar Colas until we get to spring training, into camp, and we see on how well or how poorly Colas is doing during camp.
Yeah.
But if he's doing really well, then we'll hear more about the possibility of him starting right field. So don't fret if you're one worried about, well, why didn't Grifol mention Oscar Colas? That time is coming. I think it's just because Colas is currently not on the 40-man roster for the Chicago White Sox.
Well, I would say like there's that, and also just with him being out the 40-man, he could have a terrible spring and thus they don't need to rush him, or like if he gets hurt halfway through, just like they'd rather have the roster spot open. So yeah, I think the 40-man thing would be at the end of spring when it's clear like he is the best option for right field. If it gets to that point, that's when they'd add him, but they may as well like have that flexibility just in case, God forbid, he takes a pitch on the wrist or something like that and has to miss a few weeks. May as well just have that flexibility. But yeah, right now I think that's something they have to talk around. But unfortunately, without any other outfielders in tow besides Benintendi, yeah, as we've talked about many times, watching that the list of outfielders on the 26-man roster, now there are only two and a half outfielders on that list.
And for Eloy Jimenez in 2023, I think the number is greater than 0 of games that Jimenez is going to play in the outfield. Like, he's going to play in the outfield at some point during the 2023 season. I do think the number is below 20 and a half games that Eloy Jimenez is out in the outfield. I don't see him playing in the outfield a whole lot, maybe once or twice a week and we all hold our breath that he doesn't hurt himself while he's out there while we're watching that game. I don't think it's going to be a lot of games for Eloy Jimenez in the outfield, but it's best for him to continue preparing. And if it helps him stay in shape, then by all means, go for it. Just don't get hurt, Eloy. I don't even think he's going to play in the outfield for the Team Dominican Republic during the Winter Baseball Classic, especially with how stacked that roster is. I don't know how he's going to get any playing time with that team in the World Baseball Classic, but he's on the team, and I'm sure he'll get more reps there, and we'll all hold our breath when we watch those games come in March. Hopefully Jimenez and all of the White Sox players participating in the WBC could stay healthy. But I know that got a little bit of reaction on social media about Pedro Grifol referencing Eloy Jimenez in right field. But Jim and I really don't think that's a plausible. For Rick Hahn and in his press conference on Tuesday night with beat reporters, he was asked about what's next. And obviously that is about the second base position. And I'm not going to read a Rick Hahn quote because you can make it up with the years of experience you've been reading and hearing Rick Hahn quotes. And I will say you're pretty close to what he actually said. It was a great bowl of word soup from Rick Hahn. But what it really boils down to is that, according to Rick Hahn and the White Sox front office, their job is never done and try to improve the ball club, blah, 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 GM speak. And that internally, the White Sox are fine if they start the season with Romy Gonzalez, Lenyn Sosa, or Leury Garcia as the starting second baseman. Jim, is that acceptable?
I think it's acceptable if they shore up the outfield. Usually a team has one iffy spot going into the roster. Even like good teams have like one spot they're working out, or might have a few options to cycle through before ultimately settling on a guy. And so I think, the White Sox can be forgiven if they roll into the 2023 season with like a deserving Oscar Colas in right, Luis Robert in center, Andrew Benintendi in left, quality fourth outfielder like Adam Duvall has come up, Ramon Laureano has come up as possibilities, and somebody of that ilk who can cover center field, can play right. If he's starting for a week, you don't hate it. Just if emergency strikes, that's not bad. If you get to that point and you're looking at the lineup, and I guess we'll have a sense of like what Yasmani Grandal looks like going into the season to get an idea of like, is it going to be a 50-50 split? Does it look like he can be closer to the guy than he was, even if it's like a decline phase, like a decent decline phase Grandal versus like, peak one? I think the White Sox would be happy with. Like I said, when we talked about Romy Gonzalez, I'm going to leave it to the possibility like one of these guys, Gonzalez, Sosa, Garcia, and maybe I think last year was so weird. And I think it's a conversation to have, but I wonder like if Tony La Russa's absence is going to do Leury Garcia a world of favors just by like being closer to the guy he's supposed to be rather than the guy Tony La Russa envisioned as this like super starter. And Garcia sounded like kind of miserable last year and he kept playing. I don't even know if he wanted to play. He didn't have any answers for anybody. Like I could just see him being like, just stop starting me. Like, just let me work things out and be a hero once in a while. And everybody will get off my back. So, part of me wonders if he can like just be mixed into a role versus being like the guy who plays 5 times a week, if that'll help him. But I think the jury is out a bit, like when it comes to second base. Like Gonzalez had such a cursed year last year with his health that he could be somebody. Sosa has shown the ability to improve greatly once he gets like take some lumps at a level for like a month or so. So I can see him coming back stronger. So I'm not opposed to that, but I would like to see it being like the weakest position rather than being like, right field could be the weakest position too, or catcher could be the weakest position. Like I'd rather it be just the one spot that everybody has to worry about. And I'm hoping with catcher that Grandal looks a little bit healthier. Sebi Zavala can, I think Sebi, the way he played last year, is fine. It's just the strikeout rate scares me. Like the strikeout rate is what makes me think like, oh, he could just go back into like a 180 hitter who can't draw a walk. But like the way he played last year, he framed okay. He threw not great, but not terribly. He blocked okay. He hit well enough. Like that's a backup catcher. So, there are some pieces there, but yeah, I think with outfield, it's shored up a little bit more. Second base would be fine. Cause I think one of those guys by the second half of the season could be a solution. And I'm not entirely counting out Yolbert Sanchez as a poor man's Nick Madrigal. I'm not, counting out Jose Rodriguez from being a factor in the second half. So they have some guys, they have enough guys that can cycle through to where, like, I'm thinking like 2021. Remember when like Jake Lamb and Brian Goodwin and Adam Engel, are just like, they got like 3 hot weeks from a guy that bought time. And I'm thinking like second base could be more of the same, where they're not going to be married to a guy, but they might just try to swap pieces in and out and try to find like good matchups, good healthy runs, and try to make it work until the permanent solution presents itself, assuming no trade is made.
The acceptable part. I think at second base, there's not many options available right now in free agency that you could find help at second base. I know some people will say Elvis Andrus, but let's face it, everyone. Andrews right now has options to be a starting shortstop for some teams in Major League Baseball. One of the division rivals, the Minnesota Twins, still need a shortstop. So I don't think it's plausible with Elvis Andrus. The way that the contract is set up for Benintendi in 2023, where he only makes an $8 million salary and he gets a $3 million signing bonus, suggests to me that if the payroll is roughly the same as last year, there's still a little wiggle room here for Rick Hahn to add to the payroll. And I'm talking like a contract below $5 million. And this is where you get into the conversation about Adam Duvall, or if there's any type of backup catcher that they like better than Sevi Zavala or Carlos Perez. Perez is hitting really well in the Dominican League, in the Winter League this year. And maybe that could carry over during spring training, and he's a more viable option than Sevi Zavala, which the problem with Zavala is he's out of options. So if you don't hold on to him, you let him go, and then I'm sure another team will pick him up on waivers, and then you have a problem at depth at catcher. I like the idea of Adam Duvall because Adam Duvall is hyper extreme team ball in air. Like, just warms my heart, Jim, looking at his batted ball metrics. 18% ground ball rate, 52% fly ball rate. Heck yeah. Let's bring Adam Duvall over. He'll play 60 games for the White Sox and hit 20 home runs with those types of metrics, especially if he plays the majority of those games at Gary T. Ray Field. He'll be hurt for the other 100 games, but that pretty much makes him a White Sox already. So why not get that deal done? I don't think it's acceptable if Rick Hahn in early January says, my team is on the field. I don't think that is acceptable before going into spring training. I think the White Sox need to make one more move. And like I mentioned, it's a smallish move. He did hint at the fact that it's impossible for him to know if this is the team that he has going to opening day because of spring training. And we'll see if he makes another deal. And if a team really needs a high leverage reliever, whether that's Liam Hendricks or Kendall Graveman, maybe that's a possibility as well for the White Sox. But if everyone's wondering if the White Sox are done, I think they're done by making a big signing in free agency, but there's not much out there to throw big cash out at anyways in early July in free agency, even with the uncertainty of the Carlos Correa situation. But I think the White Sox have one more smallish move in free agency that they can add to this roster, Jim. And we'll see if they do.
And not a reliever, hopefully.
Gosh.
Yeah.
I can't believe you brought that up. I can't believe you brought that up.
Yeah, I think that with Duvall, like the one thing that, you mentioned extreme ball in air, like he's had some extreme pop-up rates too, which I think is the one thing that kind of saps my enthusiasm a little bit for like an Adam Duvall in his 30s, as I can see him popping the ball up like 20% of the time to where like those are effectively strikeouts. But he certainly is better than what they have for outfield depth, and he can cover center, I still think, okay. For a part-time role. Like the White Sox do not have somebody who can, if Luis Robert gets hurt again, like who can play there? Who can rotate?
Billy Hamilton.
Yeah. I mean, and like, I've seen Adam Engel mentioned too, but like Engel kind of scared me last year, just how broken he looked, and wondering like, just is that a product of the White Sox training staff, or is that just a guy who's just, physically peaked early and he needs everything of his, physical skill set to be a major leaguer. But yeah, I'm just thinking like right now, if Luis Robert has his like customary, months long injury, then, I guess Oscar Colas would be a guy to cover center, but that kind of feels like, throwing another thing on his plate, when he's already trying to be like a decent right fielder. Kind of reminds me of like, Nick Swisher when they brought him in, because I was thinking about like Torrey Hunter and how like Andrew Benintendi got the Torrey Hunter contract 15 years later, and how that seemed like big spending back then, but doesn't seem like anything now. But like Nick Swisher, like would have been fine in a corner, but had to play center and wasn't great there. And so I'm a little bit apprehensive about stretching Colas in the center, but it would help if like they had at least somebody in their outfield mix at the major league level who could play center at least, a couple days a week to help out in the event of an emergency like that. Like maybe Colas could cover center just fine, and that doesn't sap anything away from his offensive efforts. Not great, but at least like not a liability. We've seen like, guys like Brian Goodwin play center, and like, it's fine if he's hitting, not great if he's not, but that's kind of what I'm thinking is they need somebody who can play center, and you want to see him in the batter's box once in a while, which would not be Billy Hamilton.
Well, your fourth outfielder options in early January are Lurie Garcia, Billy Hamilton, and Gavin Sheets. That is unacceptable. So we both agree that the White Sox need to make one more move, even though it's going to be a smallish move. We'll see what happens in the rest of January. Maybe that's why Rick Hahn is traveling. Maybe he's not going on vacation. We'll see. But we are going to take a quick break for a word from our sponsors as Pedro Grifol spoke more about his perspective on the 2022 White Sox on a recent podcast and how he wants to change those two areas immediately. We'll discuss that next after a word from our sponsors. Welcome back to the Sox Machine podcast. Recently, Chicago White Sox manager Pedro Grifol joined the Baseball Isn't Boring podcast with Courtney Finicum and Rob Bradford, part of the Odyssey Network. And on SoxMachine.com, we have a link to that podcast interview. I highly recommend it as they go into a lot of items with Pedro Grifol. And listening to this podcast, Jim, I first shout out to Courtney. I thought she did an excellent job interviewing Pedro Grifol, asking some pointed questions about how Grifol is going to handle things for the Chicago White Sox, especially in spring training and upcoming 2023 season. But Grifol was asked by Courtney, when he was on the Royals bench last year, what did he see from the 2022 Chicago White Sox? And Grifol has mentioned these items in passing in the past when he was introduced, but he went into a little bit more in depth. And there were two things that he really highlighted. One, it was the energy level. If the Chicago White Sox were ho-hum, lackadaisical before the game, and they weren't giving off a lot of energy, they knew, as in the Kansas City Royals, they had the White Sox. If the White Sox came in and they were bouncing off the wall and they have a lot of high energy, the Royals knew that they were in trouble. So energy level was one. Second, it was Grifol who told all of the hitters of the Kansas City Royals, really run the bases hard and try to take an extra base whenever you can, because the White Sox outfielders are so fundamentally unsound that often they would miss the cutoff guys, and that would result in extra bases for the Kansas City Royals. I want to talk about these two things because now he's the manager and this is his job to fix it. Let's talk about the energy level first, Jim. Can a new manager fix a team and existing clubhouse's energy level on the first year of the job?
I think to a large degree, yes, just because when it comes to players who might have been doing things unacceptably, or like, talk about the energy level. Let's just say like somebody with Yoan Moncada's production, like I'm not going to necessarily say Yoan Moncada's energy because we know he's had some health issues too. And he might've been like a case where like when, it might be more of a matter of the training staff, not, the communication we talked about with like not knowing between LaRussa and the training staff and the front office, like how healthy is actually a guy we're watching. Like, is he 90%, 80%, 70%? Why is he out there? So like but let's just say like Yoan Moncada, his production and just like sometimes how it looked. Let's say that is an energy thing, or like case where just he's in his head and it's not, it's interfering with his effort on the field. Like there's a case where like there is no history between Moncada and Grifol, and there is no history between like Moncada, or I should say Grifol, and Eloy Jimenez in the outfield. So if like it's a case where like Moncada is not ready to play, or Jimenez is not ready to play, or like Tim Anderson, if he's like botching some makeable plays at shortstop. Just trying to think of like the ones where it comes up in terms of like, why is this mistake being made? And the White Sox did lead the league in fielding errors last year when it comes to like, as opposed to like throwing errors. So just like the matter of like getting the glove in the right position, as we've seen. I would talk about like, Adam Engel is another guy who had some like curious decisions last year in the outfield, but he's not around. But it's a case where, there's no loyalty, there's no history. There's, Grifol has not seen these guys be better. Like he has no firsthand recollection aside from like being in the other dugout of like Yohan Moncada's 2019. So like he can't necessarily rely on that. And, same thing with like Jimenez, like the Silver Slugger form, like, he might be able to show that, but if he doesn't, like, nothing is stopping Grifol aside from like lack of other options to try to pursue other solutions if it's really not going well, or if there's a pattern of like plays not made. So that's why I can see like an uptick being made. And we saw this with like Robin Ventura, the first year that he took over for Ozzie Guillen. Like a lot of stuff just kind of went to waste under Ozzie in his last year, as he was like preoccupied with like his status and trying to get Kenny Williams fired, and just the team had to run itself, or Joey Cora had to run the team, but it was rather leaderless, or it was like self-run. And then, Ventura comes in and, he starts like having a more detail-oriented spring training, and they have the shadow ball, exercises before games that, catches the eye of other teams' reporters saying like, wow, I've never seen a team do this. Having these kind of workouts, and the defense improved, and then it slowly slid away. And then like Rick Renteria takes over for Ventura, same thing, like more detail-oriented spring training. And that worked. And then it kind of, I wouldn't say it slid away. That was more a case where just the expectations were heightened for 2021. Then La Russa happened. But I think there is a 1-year bump where everybody is maybe a little bit more on top of their games, just because they do have to prove themselves to a new boss. So I think, and especially with the way they played last year, how gravely disappointing it was, and how embarrassing it should have been for so many players on the White Sox. And we saw Liam Hendriks talking about like how they need like an authoritarian figure. And I can see like some, at least sections of the clubhouse, being cases where like, we need to be better. We need to be open-minded. I assume Grifol is not going to come in and, Alec Baldwin and Glenn Ross style, like, hitting the chalkboard and cursing out guys and dropping all kinds of slurs, and basically like, new sheriff in town. Like I see him doing a more, human to human selling job on what he wants to see differently. But I think, with how poorly they played last year, I think he probably has a lot of leeway in terms of like instilling new drills. Like he talks about like how he wants practices to be more at game speed, and whether it's batting practice, whether it's fielding drills, spring training, like he wants it to be more at game speed. And when Ventura was doing the shadow ball stuff, there was talk about like how veteran teams don't like doing that because it's a long season and it wears on people. And I think that's why Ventura stopped doing it, because he didn't have anything to prove anymore, or he made his points and they're playing better. And then maybe it's a case where like the longer he's there, it's harder to reintroduce that. But I think early on, just with, trying to figure out who's what and who has what to offer, I think there is a bump in a manager's first year, just in terms of concentration, efforts, best feet forward. And, that's why I've talked about before, just like how I think the White Sox manager should be limited to 1 year unless they get to a World Series. And I don't think we'll see that. I don't think anybody would take the job if they knew that was the case. But it's because of that 1 year boost that I can see, even if they're not going to be like great defensively, just better. Fewer bases given up just by jogging to a gap, or not knowing where to go with the ball fast enough, or making an off-target throw because they got to the ball but still didn't expect that base being taken. Like I imagine there'll be a lot fewer bases taken, or maybe some outfield assists being made on easy throws, just because they are a little bit better than they were last year.
Well, Grifol was asked about the World Baseball Classic with Lance Lynn and Tim Anderson playing for Team USA, Eloy Jimenez playing for the Dominican Republic. And not official yet, but very oft rumored that Luis Robert and Yohan Moncada will be playing for Team Cuba. There seems to be a hiccup there as far as getting the Cuba team the Cuban roster finalized for the World Baseball Classic, if they are truly going to move forward in allowing Cuban major leaguers to be on the team. Both of them have shown interest. And I think that's a valid point, because if you're trying to introduce new things into spring training, well, you're going to be losing out on 5 key players for the World Baseball Classic. And he mentioned in that podcast episode, he's a half glass full kind of guy. And his focus is getting them ready for the World Baseball Classic, not so much shying away from it and wishing that his players wouldn't participate. Instead, because of the high stakes and the amazing opportunity to represent your country in the World Baseball Classic, that you can't just show up to the World Baseball Classic 50% ready. You have to be 100% ready. So at least for those 5 players, the idea for Pedro Grifol and the White Sox coaching staff is to get them as close to opening day shape earlier so they could help their countries in the World Baseball Classic starting on March 10th. I thought that was a pretty interesting take and angle for Pedro Grifol coming into this spring training camp. And, the second part, the defensively, I don't know how much a coach can help in the very first year take a team that was one of the worst in Major League Baseball defensively and try to make them league average. I'm expecting the White Sox to be better defensively, Jim. If you can have Tim Anderson play 140 plus games, he has gotten better defensively. If Yohan Moncada could play 140 plus games, we know that he could play a good third base. If Luis Robert doesn't have some weird vertigo or some weird injury that's causing dizzy spells while he's out in center field, if he's 100%, we know that Luis Robert could be a Gold Glove candidate out there in center field and competed with Byron Buxton for that particular award. But man, you got questions at catcher, you got questions at first base, you got questions at second base, you got questions at right field. And I know Andrew Benintendi is better than Eloy Jimenez in left field, but I would say Benintendi is fine in left field. I don't think anyone's ever going to confuse him of being an elite defensive player in left field. So do you have confidence in Grifol and his coaching staff to drastically change in how well this team will play defensively? Or is this just a matter of the talent that the White Sox have, that bottom line is they're just overall not a good defensive team because of the players they have?
Well, Benintendi won a Gold Glove in 2021 in left field. So I think that improved. Yeah. I think that improvement could be legit, especially with the smaller outfield to play. Like you're going from Benintendi, to Jimenez could be sizable. Like, I think the outfield could be fine, as you mentioned, if Robert's healthy and if Colas is an everyday outfielder, good enough to play there. Like, I think he can be, I would set my expectations for Colas and Wright as average. Like, I think he can be better, but I wouldn't be surprised if there's a learning curve when it comes to just the flight track of batted balls in Major League Parks, learning the outfields, learning the warning tracks, etc. Like, just taking a while to get comfortable in right field. But I can see him being average. So I can see the outfield being better. But, as I mentioned with the fourth outfield concerns, like if Robert gets hurt, or if Colas isn't ready for everyday work, it gets messy in a hurry. So yeah, I think there is I can see this being a case where just the overall depth of the White Sox, that they do look better on the surface, but they don't have a wealth of plan Bs or plan Cs that can help them be a strength in one area, even if it's a weakness in another. Like, it's a case where they might be weak offensively and defensively, and that's a concern of mine. But that's why I think having that outfield there will allow them to have a better defensive outfielder or outfield as a unit, even if they have to move some guys around. The right side of the infield, as you mentioned, a little bit up in the air, especially since you have rookies at second base. Even no matter what, you still have a rookie at second, or effectively a rookie. And then Andrew Vaughn at first, not convinced he's going to be great, or could be a step back from Jose Abreu. So yeah, there are gaps, but really it's about the matter of if as you mentioned, Moncada, Anderson, Robert, frontline defender staying healthy. If I'm Grifol, if I'm Rick Hahn, if I'm the coaching staff, I'm trying to figure out what happens, if Robert has to miss a month. What happens if Anderson has to miss a month? What are our options? How are we going to move guys around? How can we patch this? What's the best, trade-off of offense and defense. Like that's going to be, I think, what keeps them up at night, or at least, has them working longer hours or has them doing alternate lineups in spring training to try to figure that out, because there are no easy answers there. And I think another element of the defense is going to be like how the lack of shifting affects like how every team defends. Like it could be a case where the White Sox are, not great, but maybe some teams that have been historically good are average, or maybe some teams that like haven't been great at positioning are better because they have better athletes. Like I could see there being some flux with the quality of defense around baseball, just with how teams learn to balance having the best athletes on the field versus having the best hitters on the field versus having good defense out there.
Benintendi, why did he win the Gold Glove in 2021? He had 0 outs above average. His estimated success rate was 85%. He didn't add anything there, but he had 7 defensive runs saved, which I know the Fielding Bible, which is a contributor to the Gold Gloves. That is a metric that's very heavy-handed in who decides to win Gold Gloves. Okay. Sure, he won the Gold Glove in 2021. I'm a bit shocked watching Andrew Benintendi, and I'm just a bit shocked.
In UZR, he's been above average too, but last 2 years. 3 metrics like him.
I guess so. Not the Baseball Savant ones. There you go. Now you got a difference in opinion based on 2 very big sites at Baseball Savant and Fangraphs or Andrew Benintendi. I agree with you. The outfield will be better, but there's a lot of work to be done for the White Sox coaching staff during spring training. So even though I mentioned the 5 guys going to the World Baseball Classic, it will give opportunities for the other players to prove themselves, especially defensively, and work on that craft. Because if the White Sox are not going to be better defensively, they're going to need to hit for more power so they could overcome those defensive shortfalls. But I just found it, those 2 items in particular from that podcast interview, the energy level and the lack of fundamentals, especially when it comes to defense, as 2 areas the White Sox must address during spring training. Definitely something to watch when spring training starts in about 5 weeks.
Yeah, listening to the interview and thinking about the quotes that Grifol had, like I wonder if his interview was just him and Rick Hahn and Kenny Williams and Chris Getz just complaining about what they saw from the White Sox and like getting along famously because like Grifol's ripping on him and then Hahn starts ripping on him and then Grifol rips on him some more, just saying, oh, remember that when you did this? And like, it's just going over and just finding like sympathetic ears with each other, just talking about like how much they hated the on-field product between the 2 of them and just being like, you're our guy because you hated this as much as we did, or you liked it because you would have hated it if you were managing that team. Like that's what came to mind, is just like they were just basically roasting the Tony La Russa administration between them and just like, you got the job because we've had more fun talking to you than anybody else that we've cycled through here because of like all the bad baseball you've watched the last 2 years, or at least I should say 1.5 years, because second half of 2021 was a bit of a mess for the White Sox. Just, we didn't know that it was foreshadowing things to come.
That is true. We did not know that at the time. But again, the entire podcast interview from Baseball Isn't Boring will be available on the Sox Machine podcast page. So if you'd like to take a listen, there's more of that conversation. But those are the 2 things that caught my attention from that podcast interview that I just wanted to chime on. And that will do it for this episode of the Sox Machine podcast. Thank you guys so much for listening. We'll be taking podcast highlights, or the highlights from this podcast, I should say, and posting the video versions on our YouTube page, which you could watch on youtube.com/Sox Machine. We'll add additional graphics as far as to the conversation. And if you do enjoy watching videos and you want to help us out, we're getting closer to our 1,000 subscriber milestone. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel at youtube.com/Sox Machine. You can follow us on Twitter. We're at Sox Machine. You can follow me on Twitter at SoxMachine_Josh. If this is your first podcast episode you've heard from Sox Machine, you can subscribe to the podcast wherever you listen to podcasts, such as Apple Music, and Spotify. And like we mentioned at the beginning part of the show, if you enjoy our work and you want more, you can help support us at patreon.com/SoxMachine, where our Patreon supporters get exclusive content. They get ad-free versions of both the podcast and website. And when we have new Sox Machine swag, they're the first ones to receive it. Monthly plans start at $2, and you can save with an annual subscription. Again, sign up at patreon.com/SoxMachine. The Sox Machine podcast is a production of SoxMachine.com, your home for all things Chicago White Sox baseball, and part of the Blue Wire Podcast Network. Alongside Jim Margulis, I'm Josh Nelson. Thanks for listening and watching.